Hello watch lovers, friends old and new, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian, and today we have a subscriber watch on the bench. Andrew's very early Seamaster. This one is from 1952, but it's pretty much identical to the original Seamaster from just 4 years before that, in 1948. And we see it does run. The dial has quite a lot of staining, and there's a fingerprint we can see going from the Seamaster logo up to 11 o'clock. And the second sand also doesn't look quite right. We see the case sides are worn a bit. They should be brushed, but they look polished now. And the same thing with the case back. You can barely make out the Seamaster and waterproof engravings. But all in all, the watch looks really good for a 70-year-old watch. Runs pretty okay also. Definitely not too bad for a watch this age, but we'll have to do something about it still. Inside the watch we find one of the early automatic movements, a bumper movement. The Seamaster was the first watch to have a rubber gasket, so they made very clear to state that inside the case back. Now a bumper is a bit different from the full rotor. You can see it bumps from side to side and only rotates about 120 degrees. Not entirely as efficient as modern day movements, of course, but very cool feeling on the wrist. Now underneath this plate you have this driving gear that winds the crown wheel. And that does get on a little bit of tension, so we're going to take that tension off with this crown winder. And we can take that out as well. I think it's a really cool way to make an automatic mechanism. Quite ingenious, but still very simple. And also something a lot of people could sort of ultimately come up with, I suppose, the way it works. Also lending pretty heavily from the original Harwood design for automatic watches in the 1920s. And that's how the world works. These old watches frequently has a little pin to help guide the movement into the case. And it's the same here. That also means it's only one case screw. The hands are a bit worn as well, and the loom is pretty much gone in both of the hands. Of course, there's no use in the loom anyway at this point. And another thing that's gone are the dial screws. No dial screws to be found. But the dial is definitely not loose. So that leads to the unwelcome conclusion that someone has glued the dial to the movement, which is not good practice, to put it that way. With a sharp blade we can gently try to get the dial loose. And there it is. Seems this movement has seen quite a lot of action, a lot of scratches and some damage to it. And we see the dial is also completely missing the loom. Probably someone took the radium loom out at some point. The first thing we're going to do is on the dial side, we take off this hour wheel. And underneath the hour wheel we have the cannon pinion, which is friction fit to the extended pivot of the center wheel. And without taking the cannon pinion off, we cannot get the center wheel out. So that's why we take that out first. We already let the power down, so we can take the balance out. The balance looks pretty okay, but we're going to go back to the hairspring a little bit later. So after taking the automatic mechanism off, the watch is very basic in a lot of ways. The Seamaster was really meant to be a watch for town, sea and country, meaning that it was a watch that would be suitable for the gentleman, while also being good for more sporty things and also for the water, obviously. A little bit of this same nomenclature is of course used today in Aqua Terra, so sea and land. These two springs we see here are to make the bumps a little bit more comfortable for both the wearer and for the movement. So that's a cool little thing, I think. So as I'm recording this, we're of course in the middle of a massive heat wave in Europe. It's been close to 40 degrees here in Switzerland, like 35, 36, 37 and so forth. But the craziest thing is that the UK, England, has had 40 degrees. That's 104 degrees Fahrenheit for our American friends. And you know, the way you normally know if it's summer in England is because the rain is just a little bit warmer. It's of course quite common to see British tourists when you go to like a beach resort here in Europe. And if they're there on a week-long vacation, they're milky white first day, bright red the second day. Then you don't really see them for a few days because they have to cover up or stay indoors. And then they come out the sixth day being quite pink, and then bright red again the seventh day before they go home. So for those guys to have 40 degrees, it's pretty much like being a vampire at sunrise. It's like, woof, there goes one skin layer, woof, that was another skin layer, and so on. No, Norwegians aren't really known for being tanned either, so anyway. We're down to the keyless works. Also a straightforward implementation of that in this watch. And with the keyless works off, we can take out the shock settings. Not something you have to do before putting the parts in the cleaning machine. It saves a little bit of time, and there's no real risk to it, but as the old saying goes, some like the daughter, some like the mother. So whatever floats your boat. We need to get this old glue off, and that can be pretty tough sometimes. So we try to scrape it off. It's not going to create any marks if we use pegwood. Also, of course, soften the glue with acetone or something else that doesn't damage the metal. And if anyone is in doubt, yes, it's really bad practice to just pour glue on the movement like this and glue the dial. And it seems the reason is because there were no dial screws. And that is very lazy. And find some dial screws, man. Anyway, we got the glue off, so now we can take out the last shock setting on the train side. You might have seen me look a little bit at the train wheel bridge, and this is why. You see there's some residue right there, and that's obviously not so good for a running watch. Not sure where that residue comes from, but we need to clean it out. We're also going to peg the jewel holes, and what we mean by that is to just use a pegwood stick to take out any congealed or dried up lubricant inside the jewel holes. We're not looking to stick the pegwood through the jewel hole, it's just to clean up in the little oil sink that's in the jewel hole. We're also using this Eve Flex stick to clean the pivots a little bit. It's not to polish them, but to rub them clean. And then the last thing, we're going to check the mainspring. And I do need to cut my nose hair again, I see. It's getting longer than the 5 centimeter limit I've set for myself. And a lot longer than the limit my wife set for me. Anyway, let me also demonstrate the rapid extraction method of taking the mainspring out of the barrel. And after doing my best baby imitation, crawling on my knees, we found the stuff again. What is interesting is that this is a really old mainspring. It has this bridle inside the barrel. That bridle goes along the barrel wall, and then when the manual mainspring is hooked onto it, it makes the mainspring slip. And with that, we can fill the basket and take it to the cleaners. So this is an automatic cleaning machine, which is overkill for anyone not doing this all day, every day, but very helpful when you do. They basically all work the same. The basket is connected to this rod that goes down into a cleaning liquid and then rotates back and forth. Alright, let's then turn our attention to the dial. I discussed in quite some detail in a couple of other videos about dials and cleaning them and the difficulty of doing so. Because I do get quite a lot of comments and questions about can I not just clean the dial? And man, I really wished I could just clean the dial. Dials are, however, quite delicate things. Now this is a 70-year-old dial. I did try cleaning it, as you saw, with some water and a tiny little bit of soap, but it doesn't really change anything. So we're going to have to be a little bit more drastic here. I told Andrew, the owner, that you might have to refinish this dial if you want to get that fingerprint off. But of course we do want to try to keep the dial original if that's at all possible, and still looking okay. So I tried this liquid here. This liquid is pressed from pine seeds that have been digested by male gorillas, and the gorillas have to be between 2 and 2.035 years old, although 2.036 is tolerable to a certain extent. And we do see that some of the staining does indeed go away. This dial is of course never going to be, let's say, perfect again. It is a dial that could be refinished to its original state, given that Omega is a brand that still exists, and the Seamaster was made in a lot of different examples. So you would still be able to find the original printing plates. But then again, it's always nicer if you have a good looking dial. that is fully original. Now, unfortunately, the dial will never be fully original since the original radium loom was removed from the dial. And the reason for removing it is, of course, that radium is not good for you, as discussed in the Zenith video I did a while back. So we are gonna reloom the dial and, of course, the hands as well. So let's make some loom batter. You can see I'm making a lot, so it's enough for the whole family. There is a certain consistency you're looking for. It's like liquid, but not very liquid. Kind of like a latex house paint consistency. Then we can spread it out over the hands. And then we're also going to fill a little dot in the hour markers. And after the loom has dried up, we're going to age it a little bit with some strong coffee. And do use the freeze-dried version if you want to do this. So there are no coffee grounds in your hands or on your hands. And then, of course, we're going to do the same thing for the dial. Just very gently. Alright, let's have a look at the case. The case is in really good condition for such an old watch, but it has been polished. So the original finishing has been removed, especially on the case sides. But that's basically the only thing we're going to do. We're going to apply some brushed finish to the case sides. And we see that under the bezel there's quite a lot of gunk of unknown nature, perhaps unknown to mankind, I'm not sure. Alright, with most of that off, we can also have a look at the bezel itself. Also not entirely free from gunk. It's also a little bit of rust here, of course. Before brushing the case sides, we also need to remove the crown tube. And there is a tool for that. This tool has two ends, one for pressing the tube out of the case and the other end for putting it back. So there's a lot of these different sized stakes. We get the tube out, and there we have it. And then we can put all the components of the case into the ultrasonic. Alright, while the case is marinating, we can turn our attention to the movement again. We got everything back from the cleaners. So now we're going to treat a few parts with something called Fix-O-Drop. Fix-O-Drop is a product name. The substance is called epilam, and that's a stearic acid. So it leaves a tiny, very thin membrane on the surface of these parts. And the beneficial effect of that is that it prevents lubricants from creeping. So the lubricant will stay in place much better than if you don't treat it with epilam or Fix-O-Drop. One thing we have to do afterwards is clean the pivots. So that's what we're doing here. And then we can put some oil on the capstones. And if the capstone kind of sticks a little bit to your tweezer, you can ease it out like that. And then the other capstone, we're putting on a tiny little drop of 9010 oil. In general, everything is very small in watchmaking. Obviously, apart from the muscles of the watchmakers. And then we can put the shock settings back into first the train side. And the dial side. All right, let's see if the balance oscillates freely. And that looks quite nice. The hairspring does not develop entirely uniformly, so we're going to look at that later. For now, let's turn to building the rest of the watch. We're of course going to replace the mainspring. We're going to put in an automatic mainspring. And to help the mainspring not slip too much or too fast, we're greasing the barrel wall with a braking grease. The one I'm using is from a company called Kluber. And then we can press the new mainspring into place. The trick here is to make sure that the bridle goes in first, and then the rest should follow. So this mainspring fits the barrel, but it's a little bit tight for the barrel arbor. So we're going to have to try to help it out a little bit with the use of old oiler. Note that we're not using oiler on the barrel floor. We're sticking it through the hole. Otherwise we would scratch the barrel floor. We don't want to do that. And then the barrel is ready for placement back in the movement. All right. Let's also put a little bit more lubricant on the other side of the barrel arbor. We're using thick oil here, HP 1300 or D5. And then we can rebuild the train. A mechanical watch is of course just a little machine. A little mechanical wonder. And to make that little wonder run better, we put some lubricant on all the friction points. So that's what you see me doing here. Put a tiny little amount of oil where the different wheel arbors rubs against the main plate in the tubes. And then we can put the barrel bridge back on. Also interesting to see that there was not a lot of slack in the barrel bridge for the barrel arbor. That's quite common to see in old watches. But then again, old watches were built much stronger and better than today's watches. It's a whole different business model nowadays. Nowadays they build watches mostly by machine. And to make sure the machines don't wear out the tooling, the metal is often quite soft. And the pivots nowadays are often chemically polished, which means that they are very, very smooth and very hard until they're not, because it's more or less just a thin shell over a softer core. So while you can see the pivots of wheels in this watch last maybe 100 years, on a modern watch you might see them last 10 years. And then of course they're going to ask you to replace all the parts that have a little tiny bit of wear, because that's the business model. Anyway, enough of a rant about that. We're over on the dial side, we're putting together the keyless works. Very straightforward keyless works on this watch, as in most Omegas from this time period. Again, we're using HP 1300 or D5 on most of these pivot points and friction points. For those who like to tinker a little bit, the general thinking is that if there's a lot of heavy friction of parts, like in the keyless works, you want to use high pressure grease. If there's something rotating, like these wheels here for setting the time, you want relatively thick oil, like HP 1300 or D5. And for wheels that rotate faster, like the escape wheel, a fourth wheel for instance, you would use a light oil, like 9010. Of course, the best thing you can always do is to try to download the technical sheet, the manual if you will, for the different movements, but they can be quite difficult to find, especially for these old watches. The best resource is probably watchguide.co.uk. Christian there, he has not only a really good library of watch tech sheets, but also very good information on lift angles, mainspring sizes for different movements and so forth. Plus he has a really good blog. And with the keyless works in place, also the pallet even, we just need to put the winding works in. And then we can give the watch a little wind and lubricate the pallets. And if you're curious about how these different parts all work together and how you can sort of remember how they fit together, I made a video that runs through the logic, the thinking behind each part and how they're shaped and work together. So check that out. Last step now is to put in the screw for the barrel. Important to tighten this screw quite well. So while tightening we can also wind the watch a little bit. And when the pallet flicks from side to side like this, we can turn to lubricating it. What we're going to do is we're going to put a tiny little bit of oil on this exit pallet here. And then when we move the pallet fork from side to side, we spread that oil over a few teeth on the escape wheel. The escape wheel on these old watches have 15 teeth. And if we put oil on 3 times, so we can do 5 teeth at a time. On newer watches or watches with a higher beat rate, from 28,800 upwards, you would use grease instead of oil. But for these old low beaters, we can use oil. And with the oil nicely spread out over the escape teeth, we're going to put the balance in. We have to fit the lower pivot into that pivot hole there, right there. And then it's just a matter of making sure that the top and bottom pivot align. And then the watch should start running. Whee! That's always the moment of truth for a watchmaker, the highlight of my day. Well, that sounded a bit sad. We're putting some oil into the oil sinks and the jewel holes. We're using HP 1300 D5 for the center wheel and the third wheel, and then 9-10 for the others. And then we can give the watch a good wind and demagnetize it and check it on the time grapher. Demagnetizing a watch is actually very important. There are so many magnetization sources nowadays in our society. Loudspeakers, theft scanners in stores, in the airports. So there's a lot of stuff that can magnetize a watch, and that will make it run erratically. Looks pretty okay for a 70-year-old watch. You see pretty straight lines. The beat areas are much too high. And of course the rate is much too high, but that's easy to solve. But I mentioned before that the mainspring is also not developing properly. It should be developing pretty much equally on both sides. So we need to resolve both that and that the beat area is too high. And in a watch this age, there is no easy way to fix the beat error. We have to simply turn the collet that fixes the hairspring to the ballet staff ever so slightly. We're going to take the hairspring off the staff first to fix that problem with the uneven development. Before taking the hairspring off, we also make a mental note of where the stud is, so we can replace it slightly differently to change the beat error. Now this is a bit of open heart surgery, so we want to be very careful with the hairspring. These are tiny things. If you see, compared to my index finger, it's slightly smaller. If you look at the last little part of the hairspring, where it goes towards the stud at the end there, you can see it's a little bit bent and crooked. So we're going to use a couple of tweezers to try to reshape that part of it. And that should help with the development. And that looks a bit better. For putting the hairspring back onto the balance staff, we're going to use a staking tool. What we do is first to find the smallest hole that still fits the roller. So see, this hole fits. This hole fits. This one does not fit. So we're going to choose this hole. And then we rotate this little table and center it. And that way we know that we're gonna pretty much hit the center of the balance staff when we press the hairspring back on. And I managed to position my index finger perfectly. But what I'm doing is placing the hairspring with the stud slightly off where it was before, so that we can also adjust the beat error. And the beat error is either to the left or to the right, so that's something you'll have to figure out before you try to do the adjustment, of course. Otherwise you'll exacerbate the problem. Alright. Then we can put the balance complete back into the cock. There's a little hole in this so-called boot there on the index. So I have to put something through the hole and then twist to align it properly. Also quite fiddly. But hey, you're not gonna go into watchmaking if you don't like fiddly stuff, right? Okay, put the balance back in. And then it should develop better. And with a little bit of luck, we're also taking out most of the beat error. We're going to be very lucky to get it to 0, but less than 1.0 is good. So let's check on the time grapher again. And yeah, we're going to be happy with that. Alright, with the movement running nicely, we can put the dial and the hands back on. And no, we're not going to glue the dial back on, we're going to use these little dial screws. This is an old movement, and the screws were typically a little bit bigger in the old days. So we're going to start out with the biggest size and see if that hits home. And that does actually work, so happy to see that. And with the dial secure, we can put the hands back on. Now, there is an issue with the minute hand. You might be able to see that the hole in the minute hand is not entirely round. So we're gonna round it a little bit. I'm gonna use this special holder for the hand. And then we're using a smoothing broach to open the hole up just a tiny little bit. Patience is a virtue, they say, and especially when you're removing metal. Whenever these types of parts, patience is very important. You can not put metal back, more or less, so don't remove too much, then you could have a problem. All right. Then I mentioned initially that the seconds hand didn't quite look right, and it's not the correct hand for this reference. So we're gonna find a new one. The thing with the new hands is that they're often a little bit tight. So we're gonna first try this hand and see if it fits. But spoiler alert, it doesn't. So after trying it, it's obvious we also need to open this one up a little bit, so we're going to use the same tool for that. And this time we're going to use a cutting broach. But we're going to be very careful not taking too much, because if the hole is too big, that's a bigger problem. Tiny little bit, and then we try. I had to do this 2 times before the hand fit, but ultimately it's the right size, which means that we can case the movement again. So let's turn back to the case. We need to put the case tube back in, so we're using the opposite side of this tool. I did not manage to get footage of brushing the case sides. I did not notice that there was an error in the camera saying no memory card. But here's a quick view of the result of the brushing. The lugs are not brushed, so it's just the case itself. And I also chose not to take out all the little nicks and marks there, because that would make the case sides look a little bit odd compared to the rest. Those who have followed this channel know that I'm quite conservative, and I think it's very important that a watch looks coherent. So given that the dial still looks old, I think it's important not to overdo the case. If we had refinished the dial, we would have refinished the case as well. But that's for another time then. And while talking about that, you can see I'm also polishing the crystal. Going from 800 grit up to 2000. That will remove all the scratches and leave very, very fine marks, which we then take out with something like Polywatch. And then the crystal should look good again. And with the crystal back in the case, we also need to put on the bezel. Gonna use our trusty crystal press for that. And these snap fit parts, we'd like to hear a snap. So let's see. That's a snap, all right. There we go. We can then proceed to case the movement. We're going to put the electric, did I just say electric? My God, I don't want anything to do with anything electric. First of all, I'm scared of electricity. And second, I much prefer mechanical watches if it's that kind of electricity we're talking about, or quartz for that sake. Anyway, we got the movement back in the case. As mentioned, there's this little pin that needs to fit into a groove in the case on the opposite side of this case clamp. Then we can put the bumper springs back in and the automatic plate. Important to make the springs fit snugly into those cutouts. Now, before putting in the oscillating weight, you might have noticed that it was quite discolored. So I'm unscrewing this bearing, and then we're going to try to fix this discoloration a little bit. Normally we wouldn't unscrew the bearing like that, but we'll see what we can do. We're using some silver polish on this. It's very good for taking oxidation out. So what you might see is that this liquid leaves a bit of a residue. So those engraved letters there in the weight, they are quite white now. So we're going to clean them in ultrasonic or clean it rather. And then we can put the bearing back on. Alright, with the oscillating weight ready, we can then oil the bearing for it in the automatic plate. So this is kind of a rack and pinion type system. So we see the rack here in this driving gear for the crown wheel. We need to make sure that each end of the oscillating weight can interact properly, that it doesn't bind. And once we have put that in the right place, we can lock it all down with the automatic bridge. Let's make sure the oscillating weight can go from side to side. And that looks okay. And the last bit of oiling. And then we can place a new gasket. I gave the case back and the case a very little polish, just with a nice cloth. And that's a snap-on as well. And there we have it. Let's put on a nice strap. And that's a handsome old watch. The dial, of course, still has its marks, but it is original, apart from the loom. We reapplied the brush finish on the case sides. And on the wrist, it's a very handsome old watch. Hope you liked this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will certainly help the channel. We'll be back shortly with another video. Until then, ta-ta.